The clerk's voice cut through the fluorescent hum like a blade through silk. Cassius Marcellus Clay. The words hung in the air, the Houston Armed Forces Examination and Entrance Station, bouncing off institutional green walls that had witnessed 1,000 young men step forward into history. But not this morning. Not this man. Muhammad Ali's feet stayed planted on the scuffed linoleum floor. His shoulders remained square, his breathing controlled, his dark eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the walls, beyond Houston, beyond the moment that was about to split his life in half. Around him, the machinery of American military induction continued its mechanical rhythm, clipboard shuffling, pens clicking, boots scuffing against floor tiles that had been mopped clean at 5 that morning. The clerk looked up from his paperwork, confusion beginning to cloud his features. This wasn't how it worked. Names were called. Young men stepped forward. The war machine consumed another body. Simple, efficient, unquestioned for decades. Cassius Marcellus Clay, he repeated, louder now, his voice carrying the weight of bureaucratic authority that had never been challenged in this building, in this process, in this moment of American certainty. Ali's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The name felt like sand in his ears, a ghost from a past he had deliberately buried 3 years earlier when he walked away from the slave name his great-grandfather had carried. But he said nothing, did nothing. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with tension that everyone in the room could feel, but no one understood. Behind him, other young men shifted their weight from foot to foot. Some had been waiting since dawn, their lives about to be redirected toward rice paddies and jungle canopies they couldn't yet imagine. They watched Ali's stillness with growing unease, sensing that something fundamental was breaking down in the orderly process of their conscription. The morning light filtering through high windows caught the sweat begin to form on Ali's temples. Not from fear. He had faced Sonny Liston across a boxing ring, had stared down hostile crowds in cities that wanted to see him broken and bleeding. This was different. This sweat came from the weight of absolute certainty colliding with absolute consequence. Every second of silence was costing him more than most men earned in a lifetime. A military officer stepped forward, his uniform crisp enough to cut paper, his face carrying the practiced authority of a man who had processed thousands of inductees without incident. His eyes narrowed as he studied Ali's motionless form, trying to decode what he was witnessing. In all his years of service, he had seen young men cry, seen them tremble, seen them collapse. But he had never seen anyone simply refuse to acknowledge their name. "Son," the officer said, his voice carrying decades of command authority. "When your name is called, you step forward." Ali's breathing deepened slightly, but his feet remained rooted. The word son echoed in his mind. Another claim of ownership, another attempt to place him in a hierarchy he had spent years learning to reject. His hands hung loose at his sides. Fighters' hands that had learned precision and power, now learning the strength of absolute stillness. The whisper started then, a low buzz of confusion spreading through the room like smoke. Other inductees craned their necks to get a better look at the tall, broad-shouldered figure who had somehow stopped the gears of military bureaucracy with nothing more than silence. Some recognized him. The mouth that had boasted and bragged his way to heavyweight championship, now sealed shut as a tomb. Cameras clicked from the corner where reporters waited. They had come expecting a story about a famous boxer being inducted like any other American boy. Instead, they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would echo through history in ways none of them could yet comprehend. The sound of their shudders felt like gunshots in the thick air. A bead of sweat traced down Ali's spine, mapping the geography of tension beneath his shirt. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, could sense the confusion transforming into something harder, more dangerous. But beneath that external pressure lay something deeper, the quiet voice of conviction that had been growing stronger with each passing month, each prayer, each conversation with the men who had shown him a different path. The clerk tried a third time, his voice now carrying an edge of desperation. Cassius Marcellus Clay. The words echoed off the walls of the force of official demand, the kind of voice that had never been ignored in this building, in this process, in this machinery of American power. Still nothing. Ali's chest rose and fell with measured breaths, his eyes never wavering from that distant point beyond the walls. In his peripheral vision, he could see officials conferring in urgent whispers, could feel the moment becoming something larger than anyone had anticipated. This wasn't about one man's refusal anymore. This was about the foundations of authority, about who had the right to command and who had the right to refuse. The temperature in the room seemed to rise degree by degree. Fluorescent lights hummed with electrical tension that matched the human drama unfolding below them. A janitor in the hallway stopped mopping, sensing through some institutional sixth sense that history was being made in the examination room. His bucket sat abandoned as he pressed closer to the doorway, drawn by the magnetic force of absolute confrontation. Minutes passed like hours. The other inductees began to understand that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for decades, something their children would ask them about, something that would define not just this moment, but the entire era they were living through. Some felt admiration creeping through their confusion. Others felt anger at this disruption of process, this challenge to the order that had shaped their fathers' lives and their grandfathers' lives. Ali's hands remained steady at his sides, but his mind raced through the implications of each passing second. His boxing license, gone. His passport, confiscated. His ability to earn the millions of dollars that heavyweight champions commanded, eliminated. The luxury apartments, the Cadillacs, the celebrity lifestyle that championship had brought, all of it dissolving with each breath he took without stepping forward. More officials entered the room, their faces carrying the weight of institutional authority that had never encountered this particular form of resistance. They moved with the careful precision of men who understood that whatever happened next would be scrutinized by courts and Congress and history itself. This wasn't just about one boxer anymore. This was about the power of the state to command and the right of conscience to refuse. The air grew thicker. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. Outside, Houston traffic continued its mundane flow, unaware that inside this government building, the certainties of American power were being tested by one man's silent refusal to accept the name his ancestors had been forced to carry. Ali could feel his heartbeat in his temples, could sense the moment approaching when silence would no longer be enough, when action or inaction would have to declare itself with finality. Every second of delay was another second of opportunity slipping away. Opportunity to step forward, to accept induction, to preserve the career and wealth and comfort that championship had brought him. But beneath the external pressures lay something unshakable, the quiet certainty that some things mattered more than comfort, more than wealth, more than the approval crowds who cheered when he fought, but would curse him for this refusal. The voice of conviction had grown too strong to ignore, fed by months of prayer and study and conversation with men who had shown him that true strength sometimes meant accepting destruction rather than compromising principle. A senior officer approached, his uniform decorated with ribbons that told the story of American military campaigns across decades. His voice carried the weight of institutional authority when he spoke, each word measured and deliberate. Mr. Clay, you are required by law to respond when your name is called for induction into the United States Armed Forces. The use of Mr. Clay hit Ali like a physical blow. Not just the slave name, but the formal distance it created, the deliberate rejection of his chosen identity, his religious conversion, his transformation from the person he had been into the person he had become. The bureaucracy was trying to drag him backward, to force him to inhabit a name and an identity he had deliberately shed. Still he said nothing, but his silence was no longer passive. It had become active, aggressive, a form of resistance that filled the room like smoke. Each second of his refusal was an act of rebellion that questioned not just military authority, but the entire structure of power that demanded compliance without consideration of conscience. The cameras clicked faster now, their operators sensing that they were documenting something unprecedented. The sound of shutters became a mechanical heartbeat, marking time in a moment that was stretching beyond normal duration into something elastic, something that would be remembered and analyzed and debated for generations. Behind Ali, one of the other inductees whispered to his neighbor, "What's he doing?" The question carried genuine confusion, as if the concept of refusing induction had never occurred to him as a possibility. For most young American men, the draft was like gravity, a force of nature that simply existed, that shaped their lives without question or resistance. But Ali had learned to question gravity itself, had learned that what seemed immutable could be challenged, that what seemed inevitable could be refused. The process of conversion that had begun with his introduction to the Nation of Islam had taught him that identity was a choice, that names were chosen rather than imposed, that obedience was earned rather than automatic. Sweat gathered at the small of his back, mapping the geography of tension that was radiating outward from this moment into every corner of his existence. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, worried, pleading, trying to understand why her son was choosing a path that seemed to lead only toward destruction. His father's confusion, his trainer's anger, the voices of everyone who had invested in his success, who had believed that boxing glory would be enough to satisfy him. The senior officer stepped closer, close enough that Ali could smell the starch in his uniform, could see the perfect crease in his pants, could feel the heat of official displeasure radiating from his presence. "Son, I'm going to ask you one more time to step forward when your name is called." There was again, son, the word that claimed ownership, that placed him in a hierarchy where his role was to obey without question. But Ali was no one's son except Allah's, no one's property except his own, no one's soldier except in the army of conscience that had recruited him through months of study and prayer and careful consideration of what it meant to be a true believer. The moment stretched tighter, like a rope approaching its breaking point. Everyone in the room could feel it, the sense that whatever happened next would be irreversible, would set forces in motion that could not be called back or controlled. This was no longer about military induction. This was about the collision between individual conscience and institutional power, played out in a government building in Houston, while the world watched through the lenses of cameras that clicked like mechanical insects. Ali's feet remained planted. His shoulders stayed square. His breathing continued its measured rhythm. But now, for the first time since his name had been called, he moved, just slightly, just enough to shift his weight, to settle more firmly into his stance, to communicate without words that he wasn't frozen by fear or confusion. He was choosing, actively, deliberately, with full knowledge of the consequences. The clerk tried once more, his voice now carrying the desperate edge of a man whose authority was being questioned in ways he had never imagined. "Cassius Clay, you are ordered to step forward for induction into the United States Army." The word ordered hung in the air like a challenge, like a line drawn in institutional sand. It was a language of command, of unquestioned authority, of power that expected obedience simply because it demanded obedience. It was a voice that had sent millions of young men to war, that had shaped the destiny of generations, that had never been successfully resisted in this building, in this process, in this moment of American certainty. And still Ali didn't move. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before. This was a silence of finality, of choice crystallized in action through inaction, of a decision that could not be undone. Everyone in the room understood, even if they couldn't yet articulate it, that they were witnessing the moment when one man's refusal became a crack in the foundation of institutional authority. The cameras clicked with renewed urgency. Reporters scribbled notes with hands that trembled slightly from the awareness that they were documenting something historic. Officials conferred in whispers that carried undertones of panic. Not because they couldn't handle one boxer's refusal, but because they sensed that this refusal would inspire others, would plant seeds of resistance that could grow into something uncontrollable. Then Ali moved, not forward toward induction, not backward toward escape, but deeper into himself. His eyes closed for just a moment, long enough for a prayer, long enough for a final check of conviction, long enough to feel the presence of something large in the room, larger than the moment, larger than the consequences that were already beginning to cascade outward from his refusal. When his eyes opened, they held something that hadn't been there before. Not defiance, that suggested reaction rather than choice. Not fear, that suggested doubt rather than certainty. What they held was the quiet power of a man who had found something worth losing everything for, something that made wealth and fame and comfort seem small by comparison. The senior officer stepped forward one last time. "Mr. Clay, your failure to respond to lawful induction orders constitutes a violation of federal law punishable by up to 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Do you understand the consequences of your actions?" 5 years, the prime of his athletic career. The years when reflexes were sharpest, when power was greatest, when the championship that had taken him years to win could be defended and extended into legendary status. 5 years in federal prison, while other fighters carved up his division, while his name faded from newspaper headlines, while the world forgot the poetry and grace that had made him the most famous athlete on earth. $10,000, more money than his father had ever seen, more than most families earned in years of labor, but a fraction of what he could earn in a single fight. A tiny percentage of the millions a heavyweight championship could generate for a fighter willing to play by the rules that govern both boxing and America. Ali's lips parted slightly, and for the first time since his name had been called, sound emerged. Not words, not yet, but breath, controlled, measured breath that carried the weight of decision. The finality of choice, the acceptance of consequences that would reshape not just his life, but the lives of everyone who would follow his example. I have no quarrel with them Viet songs. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread outward for decades. 7 words that crystallized months of study and prayer and consideration into a statement of principle that could not be walked back, could not be qualified, could not be softened by explanation or context. The room erupted. Officials shouted instructions to each other. Reporters scrambled for phones to call their editors. The mechanical clicking of cameras became a staccato symphony of historical documentation. Other inductees stared in shock and admiration and fear at this man who had just chosen prison over war, poverty over wealth, principle over pragmatism. But in the center of the chaos, Ali stood perfectly still. The words had been spoken. The choice had been made. The consequences were already in motion, rolling toward him with the inevitability of a landslide. His boxing license would be stripped within hours. His passport would be confiscated before the day ended. The legal machinery that would send him to trial and conviction was already grinding into motion. And yet, he had never felt more free. The cameras continued clicking, capturing the moment when one man's conscience collided with institutional power and refused to yield. They were documenting the exact second when the civil rights movement gained its most famous conscientious objector, when the anti-war movement found its most powerful voice, when the comfortable certainties of American authority discovered they were not as certain as they had believed. History pivoted on that scuffed linoleum floor in that fluorescent-lit government building. In those 7 words that would echo through decades of resistance and rebellion and the gradual recognition that conscience could not be conscripted, that some things mattered more than comfort, that true champions sometimes had to lose everything to win something larger than any title.